Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 351 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is Nell Ash, a final year counselling student who is about to do something quite remarkable. At the time of this recording, Nell is on track to become the first person since the late Anne Kearney to publish a book dedicated to class and how it shows up in our profession. Kearney's groundbreaking work, Counselling, Class and Politics, was first published back in 1999, and Nell's forthcoming book picks up this meaningful conversation for a new generation. Today, she joins us to talk about the upcoming publication and the ideas that shaped its conception. And with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 351 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly. And we are delighted to welcome you to our three topics today, starting off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about moral injury. Then we go into practice matters, as has beautifully been teed up by Rory. We're going to be hearing from Nell Ash, and the topic that we're going to be speaking about is counselling, class and politics. And then we move on to recognising you, students, on your formal journey to be a counsellor or psychotherapist in student services. And today we're going to be speaking about the journey from theory to practice. How do we link the theory and make it applicable in day-to-day practice? But starting off, as we always do, Rory, with ethical, sustainable practice, moral injury. What is it?
Well, yes. Well, I will go on to describe what moral injury is. But the reason this topic is so pertinent is that it's not often we see a presentation that we see in clients on a regular basis being recognised without pathology. In other words, not saying that it's a mental health condition or there's something wrong or we could give you pills to treat it. It's not often we see that. And for those who know DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is basically a diagnostic book that psychiatrists use. It's an American book. In Europe, we have ICD, International Classification of Diseases, 11. It's in the 11th iteration now. Moral injury has been added in to DSM as an adjunct to post-traumatic stress. And to answer your question, what it is, moral injury is where our moral compass has been shattered by a decision or a set of actions we've had to take. And I'll give you an example of that. I know a very, very, I've got to be careful here, a very lovely person who I see on a regular basis, who is a very, very, very well qualified nurse practitioner. And this person now works in a pub. And one of the reasons for that was during COVID, they had to make some very difficult decisions on who got the respirators. And they had to make life and death decisions. And as a consequence of the decisions they made, quite rightly, they were acting completely lawfully, and they had to work with what they had. People died. They had to select people who lived, and unfortunately other people died, and that person now no longer practices to any extent. And that is a great example of moral injury, where someone's moral compass has been broken, fractured. And it's as I'll go on to explain, it's a very tricky presentation to identify because of the shame that's attached to the actions that person took. So it's interesting. It may take a long time for moral injury to appear in the therapy room, in terms of what somebody's experiencing.
I love how you've kind of laid the foundation beautifully, Rory. You've given us an explanation of what it is. I have a definition here, and you know me, Rory, I love to read out my definitions, and you can get this definition because Rory actually wrote it. It's in the handout, and we'll tell you where to get that in a moment. But what is moral injury? Moral injury is the psychological, emotional, and spiritual distress that occurs when a person feels that they have transgressed or been betrayed or forced into actions that violate their core moral values. And I think that the example that you used there, Rory, is an excellent example of that. And when I was looking at this and researching it, it was interesting to me, and I had to clarify this, that it can come from two places. Moral injury can come from within self, from a decision that we made, from an action that we took at a certain time in our lives that there is shame, regret, and remorse about, that is not resolved, let's say. But it can also be that we're in a situation where you don't have any wiggle room, where, and I guess in the example you gave, Rory, you know, if you're in a medical setting, you're not making the decisions necessarily yourself. There's going to be rules and regulations that are imposed by others that we have to follow within those, and it can be imposed from externally or come from within self. I think it's interesting that does have a DSM recognition, and I think you're 100%, Rory, in that it will hide itself. Moral injury hides itself. That is its nature. It does not show itself because it is based in shame and regret and remorse. How could I do that? What was I thinking? So I want to hide that aspect of me. I don't want to show it to the world because the world will judge me as I am judging myself. And I think when you mention, Rory, that within therapy, I think it's about patience. It's about recognizing that moral injury does exist, but it's about that patience, recognition of that person, and that unconditional positive regard, because moral injury hides from judgment of any kind.
Yes, I like the way you said that. I like the aspect that it's a hidden presentation that is clearly seen. Experienced practitioners will clearly see it in the therapy room, but it'll hide in a number of ways, Ken. And we all know that the bodyguard of shame it's that secondary emotion of anger. So if you are working with a client and they're angry, I always, it's never easy working with an angry client because, of course, no one likes sitting in front of someone who's angry. I don't. And I'm sure that other people are the same. But if we can just think of anger as a secondary emotion, a bodyguard, if you like, of emotions that are too powerful, too raw, too shameful to manifest themselves in the therapy room, then we have a clue of what might be going on for the clients. And through my practice experience, I've worked with a lot of angry clients. And when you patiently wait and set the conditions for a client to speak about what's really happened to them, that soil of a different kind that Carl Rogers talked about, what happens is the anger subsides, and then from behind the anger comes the real issues, and that's usually shame or regret or embarrassment or fear of being judged. And that is where the real work takes place.
Oh, yes.
The clients unpacking that and trying to find some form of healing or some form of resolution. May not be healing, may just be resolution. It may be, I had no choice. An example of that, I've worked with military personnel who've taken life in a course of their duties. And, I think it's easy to say taken life. It was a case of if they didn't take life, that life they took would have killed them. That's the realities of war that sometimes we turn our face from. And once that appears in the therapy room, and once that can be laid out and explored, what happens is there may be a coming to terms with it. It may be a settlement, not a cure or a resolution, but a settlement. And say, well, that unfortunately is just the nature of it, and I'll just have to live with it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So you're speaking about it stems kind of from, if we look at PTS, and I'm leaving the D off on purpose here because it's the better way of saying it. That is usually based in a fear response, and it's like moral injury shows itself as a values mismatch. So there can be fear associated with it, and it can bring it up, but that values mismatch, and like PTS, when we're speaking about moral inventory, it doesn't dissipate with time. So we may have things that we do in our life where there's an element of regret around it. We go, I wish I hadn't done that. But what can you do? And we might be able to move on, and that feeling might dissipate. And with moral injury, it doesn't dissipate. It stays within the person. It's almost like a toxicity loop that just plays out and plays out. And it can be something that happened in the person's childhood that they're still playing over and revisiting in their adult life, with the emotions being as strong, if not stronger, than they were at the time that the event played out, where they said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, or the thing that they feel that moral injury around. And it doesn't show itself, it doesn't dissipate, so it is tricky, and it is important that we look for it within therapy. And there's a lovely book. It's called the 5 Agreements, and it is by Don Miguel Ruiz. That's Ruiz. I'm sure I've pronounced that incorrectly, so I apologize. But the quote that I'd like to share is, "We have a powerful memory. We make a mistake. We judge ourselves. We find ourselves guilty, and then we punish ourselves. But every time we remember, we judge ourselves again, and we are guilty again, and we punish ourselves again and again and again." And that is a sign of moral injury, when a person is finding themselves punishing themselves again and again and again within their own mind, within their own emotions, unsaid, not spoken to another human being, and it's heavy to carry it. And it's unlikely that person is going to sit down in a therapy room and after session number 2 start bringing this all out. It takes time. It takes a trust within the relationship. But I think it also means that we as the therapist, Rory, need to look out for some of the signs that we might see. And I want to ask you, Rory, what might we see in a client that might be a veil over this moral injury that might give us an indication to dig a little bit deeper there?
Well, I mean, it's the way people talk about things, I think. So, as I've said, anger, is a good sign. If someone's angry about a situation, pay attention to what that anger is protecting, because almost certainly anger is a secondary emotion. So, what is behind that? What are the primary emotions? And also, I think that if somebody comes to you and maybe they may be talking about something, so this happened and I was doing this, but I don't do it anymore. I was in the army, and making light of it, making light of things. Sometimes that's an indication that the way they've dealt with it is to kind of laugh it off a bit. And when people do that kind of laughing where it's not really a funny laugh, It's a difficult one to describe, but they may just be very dismissive of something, but it keeps coming up. They talk about it and it keeps recurring. That can be a sign of moral injury. And what I would say, it's, we've talked about, very obvious areas of moral injury, such as war, such as triaging in a medical facility. But it can be something such as someone struggling with the death of a parent. So many years ago, I had someone who came to me and he said, I carry this guilt that I've had for years. And this guilt is that I was told that my father was dying of a serious disease. And I said, well, they can't do that because it's my birthday tomorrow. And people kind of looked at me. And they carried that for years because they thought that somehow they had disrespected the fact that, their father was going to die. Truth of the matter is, it's a natural reaction. It's a protection mechanism to protect you from something that you really don't want to discuss. You'd rather kind of brush it off. It does happen to some people. So that's how it can come. And also, I think that any presentation where there's been, difficulty in childhood, disruptive childhoods, usually, if you listen very carefully and wait long enough, you will see moral injury start to manifest itself in the conversation.
Yeah, and it's kind of alluded to in the handout as well. So signs and features of moral injury: intense shame, we've spoken about it, guilt, self-condemnation. And that's an interesting one. That is something you may see from time to time within the therapy room. I certainly have, and I've certainly felt it myself. And this is, I think this is a human condition that I think that most of us can relate to at some level. I certainly can. Feeling betrayed by others, institutions, or leaders might be a sign or a tell, not being able to get over that and feeling that intense betrayal by someone else. And that's that moral compass that didn't align with mine, and now I'm in this situation and have been carrying this with me. Loss of trust in self or the world. And I think that this comes into, understanding our who we are, and there are models that very clearly speak about this in counseling and psychotherapy, of not trusting others, only trusting self. If you want a job done, you got to do it right yourself. You can't look to other people because I've been let down in the past, and I'm going to carry that as a torch, and I'm going to bear it as moral injury as I go forward. And withdrawing from others due to feelings of unworthiness, and we may see that again. That is a key indicator, I think, that you might hear in therapy as well. Somebody withdrawing, not feeling worthy to be with people, feeling less than. It can be an indicator. And it's important that we as counselors recognize this, that we see it, that we know about it, that we listen to podcasts like this, and we do a little bit of CPD on understanding what moral injury is, because there is a risk of misdiagnosis. It may show itself as depression, anxiety, and the moral dimensions of that can be missed, when we're looking at symptoms and we're not looking at the inside, because it's based in values and values being overthrown. So that's interesting. Trust issues, clients may be reluctant to disclose, fearing of judgment, specifically if we're talking about somebody who may feel betrayed by other institutions. They may arrive with us in counseling and psychotherapy and be reluctant to say how it is for them because they've been let down in the past and they carry that with them. And therapeutic opportunity, counselors can offer a safe, non-judgmental space where moral conflicts can be heard and validated. And it gets onto kind of how we work with this, Rory, in that because it hides itself, because it hides the shame and the guilt and the toxic cycle that goes on in self, as soon as the client starts speaking about it, it changes the direction of that energy, and it's now coming out. It's being heard by another, which is rare in moral inventory. It's usually only heard within self. It's now being heard by another. And if that other is you, and you are unjudgmental, and you are holding that person warmly and not showing the same judgment that they may show to themselves, I think that is a step into the path of healing, Rory.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's lots of other paths that we can take if the client wants to walk down them. And, I think that sometimes supporting clients in retelling their story with compassion, being compassionate to themselves as opposed to being judgmental. And I think that is a way for therapists to help clients generate that self-love for themselves. Sometimes, in the case of, the person who was dying, where we got to with that was that actually you were just trying to protect yourself, from something that's really terrible. And, people do that. And that exploration was really useful because the person went away and said, yeah, okay, it wasn't great what I said, but I understand that I had to protect myself for what was coming. And they kind of made a pact with that. They kind of made an agreement with that, and it became less painful looking at it through that dimension. And also, I think externalizing language, talking about it as an experience, not as an identity. I think that is really, taking away the personal aspect of it and saying, what would others have done in that situation? And, once you do that, once you move away from that very personal side of things, people might say, well, probably have done the same thing. May not make it any different, but what it might do is give the sense that they just didn't act only on their own, that other people in the same position would have done the same. And I also think that there's a renegotiation, isn't there, here? With any moral injury, what you've done is you've broken your compass, and also you've broken your values, the values that you've lived by. And I think sometimes it's about reintegrating the values, trying to look and help the client explore that this was one incident, one thing that happened, but in the whole panoply of their life, their values are intact, that they do things in their life where they can make decisions, where they act with moral, in a moral way that fits their values. So it's about the entire identity of the client.
Yeah.
So you're working. It's pretty deep work. It's pretty deep work, to be honest, Ken.
Yeah, it is. And in the handout that we have here, and I'll give you the address for that in a moment, there is actually 7 areas of intervention and approaches that you've covered, Rory. The one that you've just touched on here that I really value is that normalizing and that psychological education, that it's okay and it is normal, and normalizing the shame, really, without colluding in that self-condemnation part of things, because it is something that we experience as humans. And it is often, it hides itself because it's almost has a whisper, this moral injury. It almost says, don't show me to the world. Don't show me to the world. It is not acceptable. You're the only person who feels this. And normalizing can be really, really powerful. But as you say, Rory, it takes a deep understanding, and it takes some deep work. So we have a handout for you. It is the moral injury handout. It explains DSM and how moral injury is now part of DSM. It's got some great references for you, including a glossary that Rory has put on. And it's going to walk you through what DSM is, what moral injury is, the recognition within DSM, signs of moral injury. I keep on getting caught up because of moral inventory,
Yes.
which is another word. So we're definitely speaking about moral injury. Sorry if I say the wrong word. And why counsellors need to be aware of that. And then there are 7 interventions that kind of speak for themselves, and a key takeaway there as well. So if you want to grab that, it's free of charge. It really deep dives into the topic that Rory and I have spoken about today. You just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab. This is episode 351, and you can download it from within that page. Any last sentence to take away from this, Rory, on moral injury?
Yes, work with your supervisor. A good supervisor. If you're working with someone who's presenting with anger, or they're maybe being a bit elusive in the therapy room, they're being a bit elusive in what they're talking about. Something happened a few years ago. Speak with your supervisor and be patient. They've come to you because at some level they want to talk about what's happened, and your job as a therapist is to be patient, is to wait, and eventually what will, the real issue will come out. It will appear, but you have to be very patient. I would say it's a bit like fishing. You just have to wait until something happens. But it's really important. I think it's really important that you have some understanding of trauma training, at some level, and also that you have a supervisor who understands the process of trauma and the many faces that it can present.
Wow. I wonder how many times I've posed a question to you, Rory, and you've said the answer is CPD and training and supervision. I think it's right for every topic, because it is, isn't it? And you're 100% right. And it's good to keep that in mind. Supervisor and training. Of course, you probably know this by now. If you don't, go and have a look. If you go to counsellingtutor.com and click on our training courses, we do have a trauma-informed practice course that you can have a look at there. So that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And as we back out of that, we go straight in, head first, Rory, into practice matters. And you met up with Nell Ash and you spoke about counselling class and politics. What can we expect, Rory?
Well, what we can expect is quite a revelation. Not since the late Anne Kearney published her groundbreaking book in the late 90s has someone picked the baton up and talked about class and politics. And I think that Nell Ash, a person who's just at the end of their study cycle, will be a qualified colleague, maybe at the point of this recording, is going to make quite an impact in the world of diversity in an area that we don't usually discuss. And I'll be honest, I think shy away from. And counselling class and politics is going to be a theme of a book that Nell's going to be producing, I think in 2027. But I caught up with her to get a sense of what she will be writing and her ideas. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Back in 2002, when I was starting out as a diploma student, my tutor handed me a book that stuck with me ever since. The title of that book was Counselling, Class and Politics, Undeclared Influences in Therapy by the late Anne Kearney, a Manchester-based therapist and author. It first came out in 1996 and again a revision in 2018. And what really struck me was how boldly it challenged the idea that counselling is neutral. Kearney showed how class and politics quietly shaped the therapy room, and she wasn't afraid to call out professionalism often reinforces middle-class norms. Fast forward more than 20 years and her words still feel just as relevant. And here's the thing, it's still the only book that really digs into class and counselling. That is until today's guest comes along. With a brand new book in the works, due out in 2027, I'm thrilled to welcome Nell Ash. Nell, you're very welcome.
Hi, Rory. Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It is a real pleasure to come and talk about class and therapy today.
Yeah, and it's something I think that isn't discussed enough. So can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Nell Ash, and I'm a single mum. I'm also an unpaid carer, and I'm from a town in Teesside. I'm a writer, and also I'm training to be a counsellor, and I qualify in March next year. So that's 2026.
Fantastic.
And I started a project online while I was waiting for placement, actually, which is sort of a class thing in itself, because being from Teesside, a lot of the services have been cut for counselling. So I just managed to start a placement, and then they let all the counsellors go. So I had this gap, and I wanted to write about humour and in working class communities, and how we use humour, and how sometimes in counselling models it's looked as a defence mechanism, and I didn't quite agree with that. I thought, humour's connection. So I started a page on Instagram, and I was doing something called zines, which are like sort of online magazines, and I created one on humour in working class communities, sort of as a counter ethos really to defence mechanisms. And it's just really taken off. And I'm going to be writing, well, I am writing a book, thank goodness. Maybe that was a Freudian slip, but I'm writing a book, and it'll be out in 2027.
Thank you for that great introduction. And as I say, you're about the first person. Well, I think you're the only person other than Anne Kearney who has written a definitive text on class. I've never seen one. I've seen books on all other forms of diversity, but never on class, which kind of brings me to the next question. For our international listeners who may be thinking, what is this class business? What is class? Could you have a stab at defining it? Could you define what it is?
Yeah, I can have a stab at defining it. It's difficult because how it's defined in the UK is still quite woolly, and it tends to be around economics. So how class is defined at the moment is the job that your dad did as you were growing up. And as somebody who's got two dads, one who's never worked and one who was in a band and also claimed the dole wrongly, which he shouldn't have done. Hope I'm not dobbing him in. That never made sense for me, really. And so it tends to be on socio-economic status. So finances, what you earn. But I think when I've started the project, what I've found out increasingly is that you can define working class experiences culturally. So it's about the material conditions that you grow up in, and that stays with you as well. So you might change, you might earn more as time goes on, and a lot of your listeners might be qualified counsellors now running fantastic private practices or working for somebody and they get a good wage. But if they've grown up in working class towns or had that experience growing up, that's your soil. So it still affects how you might feel about yourself. It might bring up, there's still sort of a residue for people. For me personally, I rely on benefits because my son's disabled, so I have to be his unpaid carer. And, I think going into training, there was a stark contrast there of how I was experiencing my life and trying to scramble and, especially with cost of living things. So it's been interesting. The project is going really well, and we've had an overwhelming success, really. And I was approached by Jessica Kingsley to write a book about it. But it's very exciting.
Yeah, and I think much needed. And I'm going to pick up on your observations about class. I have to say, you've done far better explaining what class is than our current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who, when asked on a radio station, didn't seem to have a clue.
Yeah.
And I think that was quite a revelation in itself. I had a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about are we now middle class? And I said to him, the answer to that question is, if your job finished tomorrow, would you have the mechanisms, the levers, and the contacts to be able to get another job? And he said, oh, easily. And I said, I think that probably defines, that's probably a definition of class, the fact that you have contacts who have power to be able to tap into, whereas traditional working class people don't. They don't have those access to those mechanisms. So what inspired you to write this book? You've touched on it earlier on, but was there a burning passion or a gap that you saw you needed to fill?
Where I'm from in Teesside, class is everywhere, but also it's not something that I really recognised in myself being working class, because everybody's working class around me, until I went to train as a counsellor. And I thought it was me. I thought I was brash. I thought I was outspoken. Obviously, I am those things as well. But instead of putting it down to being working class, I thought it was like a personality thing. And when our tutor, God love her, because I think she probably is sick of me, and my peers are. But when she explains therapy models, I'm like, yeah, this is great. However, is this for like a white, rich man who's cisgendered, heterosexual, and able-bodied, neurotypical? Because this isn't these theories, and I like them, but they're not reaching me. They don't speak of my experience. So instead of bending her ear off all the time about that, I did a little bit of research. When the riots happened last year, I was really upset about the riots because they were quite volatile in Middlesbrough, and lads who I went to school with were going to them, and I was like, I wonder what it is, what they're angry about. It's like misdirected anger at people who are our neighbours, essentially. We're all working class, being working class isn't a monolith. We're not all a sea of white blokes, I think I said on my page. We're, we're black, brown, queer, different gender expressions, different body types, different neurodiversity. We're all different, and I don't like that we're punching sideways at our neighbour when really we've been let down by systems. And I certainly had experience of that myself, being a carer for my son, battling with the benefits system, battling with schools to try and get him to somewhere that could accommodate his needs. So that started the fire, I think. And and then there was a sort of creativity in me as well. So I started the page, and people had sort of started to say, oh, well, this is a breath of fresh air, and it's created a monster who now is looking into all sorts of different areas connected to being working class and the environment that we're in now. Because we talked about Anne Kearney's book 20 years ago, but since that, there's been COVID, and there's been continued austerity, and those are the when we talk about class being the soil that we grow up in, that soil's, difficult to grow and to thrive. And I think that therapy and counselling are absolutely great, but meeting people in that level where they come in for a session and they don't have to explain universal credit to their counsellor. They don't have to explain what a Frey Bentos pie is, or a complicated family where you had a stepdad or you were looked after cousins because your mum was doing back-to-back shifts. I think just adjusting our lens to become more class aware will really help people access. I suppose it's about access to therapy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I've spoken about on the podcast, kind of hidden therapeutic factors as part of the success of therapy. And one of those is economics and ability to actually pitch up in the therapy room. And, if you're talking about childcare issues, finances, not having enough money for the bus, having to work back-to-back shifts, all these things will affect clients who may be trying to access therapy. You've talked about being very vocal in class. Good, excellent. And I guess that brings me on to, how do you think that class and power should be better addressed in core counselling training?
I think one of the things that I mentioned on the page is that class is the great inequaliser. So it's the deal breaker that amplifies every other oppression. We can't necessarily understand any types of intersectionality. So, race, gender studies, anything like that, without looking at class. And unfortunately, it seems to be erased. We're not having those conversations. Training needs to be accessible to have every different type of counsellor should be welcomed into that, because clients need it and clients are hungry for that relational depth that a working class counsellor can give them, who's had experience of what it's like, because it's an understudied area. Particularly like the emotional architecture that comes with being working class. So on the Class Therapy Instagram page, which is where the project started, it's very conversational. So people will talk to me about how they feel about things, because as like a white working class woman, my experience is one tiny bit of what it's like to be working class. And I think as time goes on, I've really hammered down on this analogy that we don't, as working class people, we don't have accurate mirrors. What's reflected back to us, particularly in therapy situations, tend to be middle class values. So the brassy, northeastern woman might be looked at as somebody who is outspoken, might need to change, might need to regulate her nervous system because she's really passionate.
A bit chippy, as somebody once said to me.
Yeah, too chippy.
Too chippy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, what's this end goal of what healing looks like, Rory? I don't know. I think it's more about congruence and being yourself. So to hear anybody to have their edges shaved off because, some theorist once upon a time said that, our nervous systems have to be regulated. Actually, our nervous systems have to be activated so that we go and challenge things that, promote inequality. Particularly for therapists, we've got that at our fingertips. We have got the power. The power does exist in the room as well. I think we've got to be aware of that. And I think for a lot of working class people, their experience of power tend to be about, professional monitoring. If you've had social services involvement with your kids, if you go into the GP surgery and they think that, you're overweight because they've got ideas about classism that's like, we just go home and eat McDonald's all the time. you're fighting against these preconceived notions about yourself all the time. And the people who who are reflecting that back, sometimes it's like a distorted funhouse mirror. They've got an idea of what a working class person is like in their heads, and they exaggerate you so that you're like a caricature of what they think that you are. And that's come from the media. It comes from the tabloids a lot. There's a lot of classism in those things. I did the first scene about humour, we looked at like Wayne and Wayneetta Slob as an example. That in the 90s, when there was a lot of classist spectacle TV, like Jeremy Kyle, Trisha, things like that, haven't helped.
Yeah. Just for our international audience, the TV programmes that Nell's referring to, Wayne and Wayneetta Slob were part of a light entertainment comedy programme where there would be two uneducated, what's the best way of putting this? Uneducated caricatures of working class people. They were unemployed. They had no ambition. I will put a bit of balance into that, because they did mock equally. The upper classes, didn't they? Tim Nice but Dim was one of those. But I think the Wayne and Wayneetta Slob really did stick, because it was a I'm using the same word again, a stick to beat working class people with. It was a slur. You're Wayne and Wayneetta Slob, and there was a slur of a slew. That's the word I'm looking for. It could be a slur of TV programs that basically picked on working class people. I think that it was a way of getting maybe uneducated or unworldly working class people and making a spectacle of themselves. That was the kind of shows that predominated in, I think the 2000s. Thankfully, these seem to have passed now. And you're right. I think that class does come up in the therapy room. I coined the term therapeutic voyeurism.
Yeah, which I'm nicking, by the way, Ross.
Well, as long as you reference me, you're very welcome. And do you want to kind of explain what your view of therapeutic voyeurism is?
Yeah, I think so. If we use the analogy before of that sort of distorted funhouse mirror to look at working class people with, if you hold power and haven't had any of these experiences, we can kind of go into some sort of saviorism, perhaps, and think, if this person just regulated their nervous system or learned to speak in a more, I don't know what the word is.
Proper. That's what.
In a proper way.
In a proper way.
In a more proper way.
Yeah.
Then life would be better for them. If they change their mindset into one that wasn't to do with scarcity, let's say, then they might change their circumstances. And that doesn't happen, It's structural inequality that happens. But if we look at now, we're talking in 2025, Middlesbrough near me, it's an abandoned town. It's horrible to go there. And, we've got substance abuse, we've got suicides, like high suicide risk, low life expectancy, and, to, on one hand, punch down at people without that empathy, and on the second one, not walk beside them instead of, parachuting in and wanting to be a saviour. It's about listening to people and having that empathetic connection. And I think I find sometimes, like you, Rory, where we've talked about sort of therapeutic voyeurism, that it sort of takes the human out of it. Yeah. It flattens people into tropes where, you know, people have got really complex lives, really funny, strong people who are very community based. And now we're looking at therapy, particularly pop psych online, which is about individual soul in healing journeys rather than the community base that we once had and once flourished in. And we, you know, it's instead of squashing a framework, instead of squashing a working class person into a framework, we need to be much more open and say, look, you know, we can do this with sort of less hierarchical, because a lot of working class people were suspicious of power dynamics. I found, you know, a lot of us were survivors, right?
Yeah.
And you know, to take that out of it, that sort of power hierarchy, and just be on a level with somebody where you're both meeting in one world rather than squishing somebody into doing something.
Yeah, not as one therapist once explained to me that my client's life is like a episode of EastEnders, which for those international listeners is a soap opera about working class people living in the East End of London. We are also there's Coronation Street, which is working class people living in the north of England, bizarrely all played by middle class actors. Who live in lovely houses in rural areas of the country and make a fortune. And seeing clients through that lens, almost like their lives are a sitcom as opposed to a real life, and getting activated and excited. Oh, what's this episode of my client going to be this time? You know, and kind of living vicariously through that. That is my view of therapeutic voyeurism.
Yeah. And I can definitely see that. Or it's the look in people's eyes, you know. Sometimes when I say, I'm an unpaid care, and it's like, you know, they sort of get this, it's like the Hovis theme tune is going to start playing in the background, you know, and it's just not the case, you know. No. Because we're equipped with relational depth, working class people. We're equipped with that. It exists within us because we've had to use all sorts of means just to survive, I think.
Absolutely. And I take your points about it. You know, it takes a tribe to bring up a child, not some pop psychologist writing in a glossy magazine. Jessica's book is due to be published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. I'm not going to give the title out yet. The title's yet to be discussed. It'll be available in 2027, and I hope you'll join us again when the book is published. We talk about that journey from talking about and writing it to actually what it was like to be published and the feedback you're going to get. And if you'd like to learn more about Nell's project, why not visit her Instagram page, class.therapy. We'll put all the information of Nell's activities, Substack, all her links onto our show notes page. To find that, go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, go to episode 351, and you'll find all the links to Nell's work. And, you know, if you've got an idea, maybe just contact her, because I think this is my view is this is an under-discussed area of diversity, and I'm genuinely pleased, Nell, that you've taken up the torch and you're illuminating areas which I think people turn their heads from. It just remains for me to say, Nell Ash, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Nell Ash. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. And we now move from Practice Matters right in to Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Service, we recognise you, students, on your formal journey to gain counselling skills or maybe qualifications in counselling, to become a counsellor, or maybe to use those same skills in other work. And today, I guess an evergreen topic, something we return to often on this podcast, it is theory to practice. And the reason we return to it often is because there's a lot to say on it, Rory. And I think more importantly, this is a question that is asked again and again and again and again and again. And it must be hundreds of times now on our Facebook group. So if you're not a member of that, go into Facebook and put in Counselling Tutor. There we are. Come and join in the conversation. But this theory to practice, because we learn these theories, we're reading it from a textbook, it's telling us what the findings are. How does it relate to actual in the room practice, Rory?
Well, it's a great question, Ken, and as you say, it comes up in our Facebook group. Go to Facebook, Counselling Tutor, and you'll find a whole host of people asking equally insightful questions. Well, just as a thought to start this idea off, Ken, I had a coin on my desk, and when it dropped off the desk and it's landed on the floor. It's just sitting by the side of me here. And if I drop that coin off my desk every single day of the week, no matter what part of the world I'm in, it will end up on the floor, because that is the theory of gravity. And gravity is a universal theory that we could all see in action. Drop a coin, it lands on the floor. And I think that sometimes the idea that theories are fixed and replicable all the time can be a little bit confusing to students. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that. We're not dealing with coins on the floor when we're dealing with clients, working with clients. We're not talking about things like gravity or Newton's third law of motion, which are very easy, replicable. We're talking about human interaction. And I think when it comes to theory, the theory should be viewed like this. This is a possible outcome of what someone may have experienced. And it's also there also may be a possible outcome that if you use this theory, that client may very well be able to move on with their life, feel better about themselves, be able to re-evaluate their lives and think of their ongoing journey in a different perspective. Counselling theories are just that. They are theories. And sometimes, as I used to say to students, and I know that we did when we taught, Ken, sometimes you have to leave the theory at the door when you were seeing a client, put the books at the door. As one of my supervisors said, put that book down and tell me about the clients. And because I was reading from a book in supervision, them saying they're doing this, and she just gently took the book off me, put it down, and said, "Right, we'll put the book to one side. Tell me about this person," because every client is different. Every client's experience will be very nuanced. So we all deal with, the kind of experiences in life people have: death, existential crises, uncertainty about relationships, loss of confidence, talking about a difficult early history in childhood. We know those are repeating, if you like, evergreen topics, if I could be insensitive and use that word. But they're all very, very nuanced. And what we have to do with theory, I think, Ken, is to try to weave it in, because no client will absolutely fit the theory 100%. It's not like buying a suit where you'd say, I'm 42 chest, I'll buy that suit and it'll fit. Everybody is very, very different. And how we apply the theory and understand the theory needs a real nuance and a real sense of a real nuanced sense, that it might not be exact, but it might be on the theme of.
Oh, yes. So I agree with you. I love this topic, by the way, and I think that a theory is a framework, and it's really useful having a framework. So if we go to person-centered theory and we look at the stages of development, it will be a framework that may help us in doing an assessment with somebody. It's a framework. It is some work that is done by another, usually scrutinized and peer-reviewed, often published, and it will be their theory of a model or of development. And so there's the one side of it. It gives us a framework. The framework's not going to fit everyone, as you said, Rory. And it's very interesting. If you study the counselling theories, you will often hear the same wording and the same concepts described by different theorists, and it sounds like they're explaining the same kind of human presentations. Yeah. So it's just somebody else's words or idea of crystallizing what we know as the human condition and what we all feel as humans and what we experience as we go through life, and how we act and react within that. Now, here's an interesting for you, is sometimes theory is more understandable in retrospect. Now, that's going to sound a bit woolly, so I'm going to define it more. I recall during my own training, and I'll use myself as an example here, reading of the theories, the counselling theories, finding them quite interesting, and there were certain things that I could see within myself. Introjected values, I'm using as an example for that, where I can look in self and go, ooh, yes, I like that theory. I can see that within me. Yep, I can see that I have introjected values, which was out of my awareness before I learnt about them. But there were also theories that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, that I couldn't necessarily see acting out within myself until I was writing about those theories after being in placement with clients, where I had to link the client's presentations to the theories of the model that I was studying. And suddenly it started to make sense. So reading and writing in assignments about the theories before I was in placement, I know I didn't have a full understanding of it. I may have been able to say what the theory said, but I didn't have that felt sense of actually witnessing it in a client and seeing it happen. And I recall when I went to my supervisor, I was questioning person-centered theory. I was saying, but is it really enough? And then I had a client, and there was a massive shift in this client from nothing that I'd done except be with that person. They'd done all of the work. And I remember going, wow, I see it. I see this person growing within this theoretical model, and it made it more understanding for me. So if you are studying it in a textbook at level 3 and you haven't seen any clients and you're struggling to fully understand what that is, clients may show you and surprise you as you go forward, Rory.
Yeah. I think that it's only when you actually come to practice the theory, like music, isn't it? You could learn to read music without actually playing an instrument. I think that's the case. I dare say I get some letters about this, but I think
you're right there, Rory. I think that you can definitely put that as a fact.
All right. Well, we'll leave that there before I get my post bag fills up. But I think you could read music, but to appreciate music is a very different thing. And sometimes you can listen to music. I'm not that I'm a musician, and you know, it doesn't have any connection too much with how music is written. There's a lot of musicians who play music who can't read music. Noel Gallagher is one of those people from Oasis, one of my favourite bands that I don't need to remind anybody, but he famously said that he can't read music. So he doesn't understand the theory. However, he understands the practice of it, and he knows, obviously, he's a very accomplished songwriter. And I think the same goes really for counselling. You know, sometimes, you know, before we learn one of the things that really struck me as a student was that I would listen to clients before I'd fully kind of understood the theory, and I'd go back and listen to the theory and look at the theory, and I'd go, so that's what that is it? I've often wondered what that is, and that's the theory. And
yes.
and what the theory does is it gives you a vocabulary to make sense of it, to conceptualize what's going on. So a good example of that would be introjected values. Let's take a person-centered staple, introjected values. And you hear someone, they talk about, well, I can't do that because I was always told I was stupid, and I'll never make anything of myself because I was never that academic at school. This is getting a bit personal, this one, Ken, and so on and so forth. And then you think to yourself, well, hang on a second, that now I know that's an introjected value and a condition of worth. That is why I think the way I do, and that then gives you the ability, and this is the important thing about theory, to write about it in your assignments. You could write about it and say that this is what the client's saying, and this is the theory that would underpin it. But also, and I think more crucially, it gives you a vocabulary to discuss it with your supervisor and other professionals. So you can say, this is what the client said, and I think that's an introjected value. And at that point, something really wonderful happens. Either the person agrees and says, yep, I think you're right. Or they say, what else could it be? What else might it be? And then you might think, yeah, it's something else. It has an aspect of that, but there's something else to it as well. And you're on the next journey of discovery with the theory. And as you go on to the next area of discovery, the next time it presents in the therapy room, you say, it might be this and it could be that. And that is how you link theory to practice. It literally is, I guess, like playing a musical instrument.
Yes. And isn't it interesting that another great use for theory is getting through your assignments? Because how else can the academic establishment measure your knowledge of what it is you're doing? So they question you on the theory. So it kind of shows that you know what you're doing. But like you say, Rory, when you're going into that session with the client, we're kind of leaving the theory at the door, because what we're not trying to do is fit a client into a certain shape. But we may, after our session with a client, take those shapes and go, oh, that actually fits neatly over what I've just seen or how that person is presented. And it doesn't change anything other than gives us a framework to speak about in supervision, or like you say with a peer, or to do deeper research. And I think you're 100% right, Rory. And I think that's what drives research, is that theories are by their very nature very limited. They cover an aspect, and you may look at it and go, it's a lot more nuanced than that. I'm going to study a tiny little bit of that theory and expand on it, as many have done and will continue to do. And I think that's kind of what fuels research. But you'll come out of doing that research and have something that you may be publishable. And guess what? You're adding to the theory. And if you look, one of the questions you're going to be asked when you're doing your assignments, Rory, you'll attest to this, is explain the theorists that underpinned and kind of influenced Carl Rogers, for example. And because a theory is built on a theory is built on a theory. And it's interesting. And like you say, Rory, it's a framework, it's a scaffolding, very, very useful. Sometimes I think that the theories can be quite deep, and I can happily put my hands up and say, you know what, Carl Rogers' 19 propositions, I read over it and the wording is pretty heavy, and it feels very difficult for me to get my head around even now, looking at the 19 propositions. But I do know that if you look at them individually and try and kind of decode them, you can go, aha, I see where that links in, and I see where that links in. But there's not a time where I'm going to be sat there in a session with a client trying to evaluate where they are within that theory. I'm being there with them in that moment. And it might be afterwards that I can go, oh yeah, that actually matches and maps to that theory. So I guess my question then, Rory, is this theory to practice something that eventually becomes just a subconscious process that plays out?
Yeah, I think it speaks to I can't say the word. It's escaped me, Ken. But where you're competent, unconscious competence. There we go. That's what I was trying to say. Unconscious competence, where like when you're driving your car or tying your shoelaces, you do it really without thought, and it sort of comes together. But I think takeaway should be clients are not research subjects. We shouldn't sit in front of a client and treat them like something that we have to observe, like a field observation where we take notes and report back. You know, the one of the things that the research is absolutely clear about, no matter who's done the research, is the quality of the relationship. The relationship is a key indicator to positive outcomes in therapy. So if we park our books at the door and do what my supervisor did and just take my book off me, put it away, and say, who is this client? Who is this client? You know, what's going on for them? How can I be of better assistance? And I think if you start with that, the theories will just drop into place. But please don't go in the therapy room with a theoretical hat on, you know, thinking that you're there to do an observation exercise. You're not. You're there to be a therapist, and you're there to try and facilitate that human being that's in front of you, their own journey, and help them affect, for want of a better word, a cure or a resolution to where they find themselves.
Yeah. There's a lot more to this. Theory to practice is ongoing. It raises its head a lot during student journey because you're writing about it and you have to explain theories and then you have to explain how you've put that into practice. For those of you listening to this that are students, that are members of our Counselling Tutor student library, if you log in and just search Theory to Practice, you'll see we have a load of resources on that, lectures on it, all different areas of theory to practice and writing about it in assignments. And if you're not a member of our student library, just go to counsellingtutor.com and just click on our products and it's right there, the student library. So that is the end of our student services as we place that theory to practice, Rory. And this has, of course, been episode 351 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
It has, Ken. And we started off with ethical and sustainable practice. We talked about moral injury, a term and a presentation that has come of age, really, with its inclusion in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And we worked through what that might look like and how it can often be quite hidden in the initial stages of therapy. In Practice Matters, we spoke with Nell Ash, a person I think that we should take their name and watch them, because I think she will be adding to the canon of diversity conversation as the years go by. And we talked about counselling, class and politics. Fascinating interview, if I say so myself. And in student services, Ken and myself talked about theory to practice. How do we make sense of what we learn in class, and how do we learn about the theory while working with clients? And as always, thank you for your likes, shares and subscribes. So until the next time we meet, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.